Hey everyone, this is Shiro, and welcome to the first part of my La Signora Deep Dive, a series which aims to answer one, or rather two, questions that, at least in my eyes, have never been properly addressed. Many have tried, and some have indeed managed to get very close to what I would have liked to see, but until now nobody has plummeted all the way down this rabbit hole, at least not anybody that I could find. But what are those two questions that I've mentioned? Well, firstly, is La Signora actually dead? And secondly, will she ever return? This topic has been argued about a lot in the past, especially when a certain Musa Hitotachi incident first took place. But neither side of the debate has, in my eyes, ever fully explored these topics. People just took whatever snippets of evidence they could find that supported their bias and outright ignored everything else, or brushed it off with little explanation. Like I said, there were a couple of people with more nuanced, in-depth takes on all of this, but there have been few and far between. One notable one that I'd like to mention is Silicon14, who has, at least in my opinion, the best video on the topic that I could find. Of course, there are very likely others that I'm simply not aware of that might rival his work. In any case, after more than 2 years since La Signora stepped off the stage, we've gotten a handful of new, relevant pieces of evidence, and enough time has passed to properly revisit the topic of her fate with an unbiased, thorough approach. To be perfectly honest with you, I was amongst the people who were fully convinced that La Signora, or rather Rosalyne-Kruzchka Lohefalter, who I shall simply call Rosaline from now on, is alive and well. I did have a significant bias at the time, which definitely influenced the way I saw things. I loved Rosaline as a character after all, and was, very slightly, in coping mode. Now, years later, I can manage a far less subjective approach at figuring out this mystery. Yes, I just call it a mystery, because that is what it is. If you think that the answer to the two questions that I posed before is a simple, straightforward one, then you couldn't be any further from the truth. To get a real, proper answer, we have to throw out all of our opinions and biases as well as wishes. All we'll do is look at all the evidence that we have available, figure out how trustworthy our sources of information actually are, and then put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Whatever picture we'll end up with, that is our answer. Small spoilers, it's not even a clear picture, but it's the best that we can possibly have at this point in time. First in the agenda of figuring out Rosaline's fate, we have to look back on her history so that we can have a proper understanding of what kind of being we're even talking about. A little more than 500 years ago, Rosaline lived in Mondstadt. During her maiden years, she loved to sing in the square, catching the eye of the usually ever dour Rostam, and both of them fell in mutual love with each other. She was the only one who ever made him think about his own life and future, not just his burdensome duty. Eventually, she was accepted into the Sumeru Academia, most likely as a Spantamat student, apprenticing in pyro-related skills like the art of liquid fire, an art that has been lost to history ever since. Some time before she left, Rostam gave her a special hydro timepiece, an hourglass that would let her keep track of the time that she would be away from home. After one cycle, she would have finished her studies at the Academia. Little did she know that what was meant to be a painful but temporary separation would turn into a permanent farewell upon her return. While she was in Sumeru, the cataclysm struck and took the life of Rostam as well as countless others. Despite the intervention of the Anemo Archon Barbatus, only the worst possible outcome could be prevented. When Rosaline arrived back in Mondstadt was when she learned that her beloved had breathed his last during the battle against the monsters that threatened their home. But although her home remained, it mattered not. Those dear to her, her maiden years, as well as her bright future, they were all gone. After mourning Rostam's passing until her voice and tears had run dry, she swore to use her life's flame to cleanse the world's crookedness, to burn away all the demons in the world. Using the art of liquid fire, she was rumored to have sacrificed her mortal body to become the embodiment of liquid fire herself. Clearly this was no ordinary fire, because it's also referred to as the eternal blaze, eternal flame, and hellfire. With a fire that shall burn for eternity flowing through her veins in the form of molten hot agony and rage, she transformed her grief into power to destroy all monsters, and became the Crimson Witch of Flame. Replacing all the blood and tears within her body with fire came at a tremendous cost, over time scarring both her face and her body. Even her by now dangerously fragile emotions weren't spared. People were terrified of her, despite her only ever harming monsters and demons. In the end, only the birds that chirped by her side remained to soothe her pain. Eventually, the director of the Fatui, Piero, found her and convinced her to join the Tsaritsa's cause. Fortunately, he reached her before her heart could be destroyed by the eternal blaze, before her flame of life could die completely. As a small side note, it is unclear whether this refers to the last vestiges of her positive feelings, whose removal would result in her practically turning into a monster herself, or her actual heart and therefore life itself. However, even if the latter were the case, the fire that Rosalyne had started would still continue to burn eternally, considering how often it is referred to as an eternal flame. Now, back on track. She was granted a cryo-delusion that took the place of her past, and even her real name. All the pain, grief and rage, as well as the undying flames, were sealed away, along with her memories of her past. By choice, she became La Signora, the Fair Lady, the staunchest supporter of the Tsaritsa's dreams, with her only goal being to bring the future that Her Majesty wanted to see into being. She did this in part because Piero, the Tsaritsa and herself shared the same exact goal: to cleanse Teyvat of the short-sighted, ignorant gods related to Celestia, as well as the darkness and corruption of the Abyss. Another part of her reasoning was to forget the pain that Rostam's passing had caused her, even if she needed to fall into a delusion to do so. And yet, her cryo-delusion couldn't completely seal her past, because a pure white flame continued to burn within her heart. As of now, we have no idea what this flame might be, but there's a high possibility that it may refer to the very core of the eternal flame. Many hundreds of years later, sometime before the traveler arrived in Mondstadt, La Signora returned to the city as a diplomat from Snezhnaya, putting various plans into action to eventually draw out the Animo Archon and take his gnosis without leaving behind any evidence that the Knights of Favonius could use to start a serious investigation. Ultimately, she succeeded, and even kicked the defenseless Barbados in the process, likely a result of her forgotten past subconsciously influencing her actions. Shortly after, she traveled to Liyue, where she brokered a deal between the Geo Archon and the Tsaritsa. A contract was signed and yet another gnosis was obtained. With the goal achieved, she returned to Snezhnaya to hand over the gnosis. Sometime later, she made her way to Inazuma, with her goal being to obtain the Electro-gnosis. Realizing that the traveler could interfere with her plans if they were left to their own devices, she asked the Kanjo Commission to stall them on Rito. For a short time, she was in charge of handling the Delusion Factory's productions, but she handed that job over to Scaramouche at the first chance, finally getting the opportunity to refocus on obtaining the gnosis. During her visit to Tenshukaku in her position as a Snezhnayan diplomat, the discussion with the Raiden Shogun puppet got interrupted by Kujusara, who she easily knocked out, only to, right afterwards, encounter the annoyance that she had wanted to keep out of her way: the Traveler. Not taking them all too seriously, she played ignorant and refused to dance to the Traveler's tune. However, something that she had never expected happened. The Traveler challenged her to a duel before the throne, which the Raiden Shogun puppet approved. Although La Signora was taken aback by this, she didn't think she could ever lose to the Traveler, so she accepted the duel. During the confrontation, she found her cryo-delusion's limited abilities to be lacking, so she deactivated it. As a result, the seal of ice was broken, and all that she had sealed away surged forth once again. The painful memories, the eternal flames that were now little more than embers, the undying hellfire butterflies, as well as the face of her beloved Rostam. All of them overcame her once more, transforming her into the Crimson Witch of Embers, a significantly less powerful version of the Crimson Witch of Flame that she had been in the past. And yet, despite the power-up, Rosalyne couldn't defeat the Traveler. She eventually lost the duel and returned to her appearance as La Signora, falling to her knees weakly. Another crisis awaited her right afterwards, because the one who lost the duel would be formally executed by the Raiden Shogun puppet's Musuno Hitotachi. Filled with disbelief at her loss, panic at her impending execution, As well as all those feelings resulting from the memories that she had just regained, she made a last-ditch, desperate effort at taking the Electro-Gnosis by lunging towards the Raiden Shogun puppet and clawing at her chest, unaware that the Gnosis had already been handed over to Scaramouche by Yae Miko in exchange for the Traveler's life. But even if this attempt hadn't been futile, she couldn't ever have succeeded, because the Raiden Shogun puppet was far too powerful for her to contend with in her severely weakened state. As a result, she got an intimate taste of the Musono Hitotachi, after which her still intact body dissolved into ember fragments and ashes. Once news of La Signora's demise reached Snezhnaya, the Fatui Harbingers met up to hold a symbolic funeral with an empty coffin, with Pulcinella decreeing that all Fatui would halt their work for half a day as a sign of mourning. Interestingly enough, multiple Hellfire butterflies could be seen during this event. The next step on our journey to a real answer brings us to Rosalyne's design, as well as the symbolism inherent within. These two aspects are far too connected to cleanly separate them, so I shan't even try to do so. Instead, we'll be going over each part of a design and discuss the connected symbolism right afterwards. Let us begin with her titles, La Signora and the Fair Lady. Both of these are essentially the same title, as the Italian phrase La Signora means the lady when translated to English. As you're undoubtedly aware of by now, all of the Fatui Harbingers are based upon stock characters from the Commedia dell'arte, an early form of professional Italian theatre that was popular throughout Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. La Signora was one of these stock characters. She was often the wife of Pantalone and the mistress of Petrolino, and was typically represented as tough, beautiful and calculating, while also being proud and prone to ridiculing others. She overdressed and wore too much makeup, appearing as fake and vain as anyone could be. Every now and then, she was a courtesan who managed to steal the heart of an older gentleman, who was usually Pantalone. Every Harbinger was clearly partially based upon the Commedia's stock characters, but it never went beyond simple inspiration because the Harbingers are very different from the Commedia counterparts. In Rosalyne's case, while she does share many of her counterparts' personality traits, she is also ever loyal and devoted to her beloved Rostam. There is no hint of a romantic or sexual relationship with anyone else at all. This is in stark contrast to the Commedia's La Signora, whose core trait it was to seek physical pleasure and cheat on her partners. Next, let us dissect Rosalyne's real name, Rosalyne-Kruzchka Lohefalter. Considering the rest of her design, which will be further elaborated on later, her first name, Rosaline, is most definitely of Latin origin. Rosalinda can be translated as gorgeous or wonderfully beautiful rose. Descriptors like pretty or beautiful would not do it justice. Roses can symbolize romance, love, passion, beauty, courage, confidentiality, and far too many other concepts. One thing that I shall note here is that the white rose commonly represents innocence or purity. As for Rosalyne's last name, Lohefalter, it's German for blazing moth actually. It can also mean blazing butterfly, but the more accurate translation is blazing moth. Butterflies can symbolize transformation, hope, rebirth, freedom, beauty, love, and the human soul, while moths can symbolize change, transformation, growth, death, rebirth, and intuition. Last but not least, her second first name, Kruzchka, is not actually a real name. It does not exist in this specific form. There are similar words, but none that are exactly the same. Most likely, the name is derived from the Russian Kruzchka, which can mean mug, pot, tankard, jar. You get the gist of it. Kruzchka sticks out like a sore thumb from the otherwise clearly Mondstadt-related name, and I do think I know the reason as to why this is the case. In Germany, which Mondstadt is primarily based on, there's a concept called the Patenname, which translates to godfather/godmother name in English. It's a tradition where your godfather's/godmother's first name will be added to your first name as a second first name. There were often instances of people having a mixture of male and female first names as a result, which often led to bullying, as you could guess. This tradition was even still somewhat around during my generation, but because it's gotten increasingly out of fashion over the centuries, you barely see it nowadays. In any case, I propose that Kruzchka is Rosalyne's Patenname, which means it was originally the first name of her godfather or godmother, who seems to be of Snezhnayan origin. This means that Rosalyne's family had some sort of a close connection to someone from Snezhnaya, but that's all we can say. One other part of Rosalyne's design that I'd like to especially mention is the funerary mask. Funerary masks are also called death masks, and are the likenesses of a person's face after their death that were used to cover the faces of the deceased. This could symbolize the Fatui's action of forsaking their true names and faces once they joined the organization, in a way ending their previous lives. However, the funerary mask clearly looks nothing like Rosalyne's face, so why is this the case? Interestingly enough, the funerary mask's original Chinese name can mean two different things: mask of funeral and mask of mourning. In other words, a mask that someone would wear at a funeral or thereafter to mourn the deceased. In Rosalyne's case, her beloved Rostam, whose passing she has never stopped mourning. I'm reasonably certain that both of these different meanings are intentional because they fit Rosalyne like a glove, or a mask in this case. As for Rosalyne's visual design, there are 5 major themes that stick out, so let's go through them one by one. Firstly, roses. These are definitely a nod towards Rosalyne's name, there's no doubt about that. She has 2 rose-shaped hair buns, as well as 2 white roses on her outfit as La Signora. Earlier I mentioned that white roses commonly are a symbol for innocence and purity. Here it's likely that they are meant to represent Rosalyne's naive, pre-Crimson Witch self. But every rose does have her thorns, which can be seen on the back of her mantle. Next, as you might have already noticed, hearts are also present in her design. The back of her mantle shows the aforementioned thorns surrounding a heart, and in the first phase of a boss fight, hearts of flame are placed around the corners of the arena. It's likely that these hearts embody the love she harbors for Rostam. Something else that is near and dear to her heart, singing, is also represented in the various sheet music inspired elements of her design. There are the tattoos on her calf, which are akin to abstract forms of musical symbols, as well as her earrings, her catalyst, and many of her first boss phase's attacks, like Hailstorm, Glacial Missiles, and the Frozen Void. But let's not delay any further and address the fluttering insect in the room. All of Rosalyne's butterfly or moth-related visual design elements. Honestly, they are extremely hard to miss, so I shan't go into too much detail when it comes to the obvious features. Let us instead talk about an easily overlooked design element that relates to butterflies and moths. The eye spot, a type of mimicry that various butterfly and moth species have developed to defend themselves against predators. These can only be seen in Rosalyne's Crimson Witch form. If you ever wondered about what kind of moth primarily inspired Rosaline and her constellation as La Signora, then look no further. It's Axelia putris, also known as the Flame. Aside from the fact that it looks very similar to the constellation and that she has the fire theme, there is one deciding detail that seals the deal. Its resting form, where it wraps its wings tightly around its body, is very strongly reminiscent of Rosalyne's back view as La Signora, which could be considered the resting form of the Crimson Witch. La Signora's mantle and silhouette look very similar to the moth's wings and overall silhouette respectively as well. All of this was first pointed out by Reddit user Diatex, and I've never been able to unsee it ever since. There's one other element that I've seen misidentified as eye spots by some, and that is the Greek letter theta. It can be seen on the long sleeves of Rosalyne's La Signora form, as well as on the very end of the lower back of the Crimson Witch form. Theta stands for bad luck, as well as death. In an archaic form of the Greek alphabet, it was considered its 9th letter, but it's nowadays the 8th. And the number 8 is what we're going to talk about next. Rosalyne's design is brimming with the number 8 in many places. Not only is she the 8th of the 11 Fatui Harbingers, but it took exactly 8 patches since her first appearance in version 1.0, for the Musa no Hitotachi incident to take place in version 2.1. It took Hoyoverse 8 months to complete the design of a boss fight, and a total of 8 people participated in its making. There's also the aforementioned theta, the 8th letter of the Greek alphabet that is present on all of our models. But what does the number 8 stand for? Amongst others, there are infinity, spiritual perfection, completeness, and purity. But according to the Bible, it symbolizes the beginning of a new life, the promise of a second coming, and the resurrection from the dead. The reason as to why I pointed out the Bible in particular is that Hoyoverse seems to have designed the Harbingers with biblical numerology in mind. I first became aware of it when Ashikai mentioned it in a video from 2022, which I'll leave a link to in the description down below. Parts of it have become a little outdated, but it's definitely still worth the watch. The best example of Hoyoverse's obsession with making sure that the Harbingers are aligned with the associated numbers is Tatalia, and this number 11, which in biblical numerology symbolizes chaos, disorder, judgment, and the irresponsibility of breaking the law. Just like Rosalyne, there are far too many connections that can be made between the number 11 and him, other than just his Harbinger number. He was released in patch 1.1 and his first banner began on the 11th of November. His first rerun was the 11th banner of the game, and his second rerun happened in version 2.2, exactly 11 months after his first banner. I could continue, but I think you get the point. The last aspect of Rosalyne's visual design that I'd like to draw your attention towards is the flower of the Crimson Witch of Flames artifact set, as well as her boss material, Molten Moment. They both visually resemble a red lotus. Lotus flowers, in general, symbolize purity, enlightenment, self-regeneration, and rebirth, while the red lotus in particular represents love, compassion, and generosity. Now that we've discussed all aspects of Rosalyne's visual design that I found noteworthy, let's take a short detour to the realm of music and OSTs. In July 2022, a Reddit user pointed out that all music associated with La Signora and Fischl share the same leitmotif. In case you're not aware, a leitmotif is a, and I quote, recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. Instead of trying to describe the similarities, let me play you a clip that was put together by the aforementioned Reddit user.
棺にて長き眠りにつき、熱い憲兵の中に閉ざされようとも、我が輩が約束しよう、ロザリン。貴公の棺が旧世界の全てとなるだろう。
Did you notice it? I won't speculate about what this unmistakable similarity might mean, but I found it noteworthy enough to present it to you, just in case you weren't aware of it before. There's one more topic that we'll have to discuss though, the Teyvat chapter interlude teaser A Winter Night's Lazzo. Lazzi are stock comedic routines that are associated with the Commedia dell'arte. They are rehearsed jokes that can be inserted into a scene at various points to keep the audience entertained. Basically, they are classic gags that can be pulled out whenever it feels necessary. This puts A Winter Night's Lazzo into a new perspective. It's all a rehearsed comedy routine. One particular line of Piero's, "It's time to end tonight's foolish theatrics. Right now you have no captive audience," seems to imply that after this point, a little more than halfway through the video, the joke ends. However, we don't know if that's merely another part of the performance. What we can say, though, is that amongst all of the hundreds of Lazzi that I could find after considerable research, every single Lazzo that is about death or a funeral is always about someone being mistaken for dead, or simply faking their death, sometimes repeatedly. Examples of these would be the Lazzo of the fake death, the Lazzo of the melodramatic death, and the undead Lazzo. Never once is someone who is referred to or thought of as dead in a Lazzo actually dead. It's never, ever the case. This truly cannot be understated. Our last stop here in this first part of the La Signora Deep Dive will be a summary of all the symbolism that we could observe, which will make it easier to pick out central themes. I'll begin with the more minor ones before focusing on the ones that are nearly omnipresent in her design at the end. Additionally, I'll also associate certain symbolisms with each other if they are extremely similar or in the same vein. For example, love and romance. There are 8 minor themes: generosity, compassion, infinity, intuition, freedom, hope, confidentiality, and courage. In all honesty, we shouldn't put too much importance on them. All of them are, at most, slight side notes in the story of the character that is Rosaline, or are in some way, shape or form connected to the other, more important symbolisms. Speaking of them, there are 8 major themes. Kind of funny how both of them are 8. This was not part of the script, I just noticed it now. I'll definitely leave this in because it kinda cracked me up. I'll go in order from the least prevalent to the most prevalent one. Number 8. Beauty. Number 7. Enlightenment, spiritual perfection, and completeness. Number 6. Purity and innocence. Number 5. Transformation, growth, and change. Number 4. Death, mourning, and the human soul. Number 3. Fire. Number 2. Love, romance, and passion. And number 1. Rebirth, resurrection from the dead, fake death, and self-regeneration. This last one was more than twice as prevalent as the others. I'm sure you can already think of many ways in which all of these themes apply to Rosaline and her backstory, but let us talk about her most important theme, rebirth, a little, because there has been a borderline nonsensical claim about why exactly it's so excessively prevalent in her design floating around in the community for a long time now. It's time to put it to rest. The argument is that the rebirth symbolism refers to Rosaline being figuratively reborn as the Crimson Witch of Flame. In a way, her old life ended and a new life began. Alternatively, some people claim that her joining the Fatui and sealing away her old life is the point of rebirth. At face value, this doesn't seem like an erroneous line of thinking. However, once you look at many other characters in Genshin Impact that have had similarly drastic changes in their lives, making them into completely new, different people compared to who they were before, one example of this would be Xiao, you'll find that with none of them is the concept of rebirth even remotely as prevalent as with Rosaline. For most of them, it's not even a concept that's incorporated into their design at all. Rosaline's life story, while tragic, is not truly extraordinary if compared to other characters in the game. Many of them have been reborn in similar ways that she was reborn as the Crimson Witch of Flame, or as La Signora. She's also not the only one with multiple of such rebirths. Therefore, the argument that this excessive amount of rebirth symbolism refers to merely such an event could only be considered plausible if version 2.1's Archon Quest had never happened. Rosaline left the stage in a fashion akin to dying. For the first time, she, in the eyes of most Genshin Impact players, was considered to be dead. Now that a vastly superior option for potential, actual rebirth is on the table, to stick to analyses that were made before this event is outright delusional and biased. In the second part of my La Signora deep dive, we'll analyze the Musono Hitotachi incident in excruciating detail, don't you worry. That's the reason why it was suspiciously absent from this video. Additionally, we'll be taking a look at the multiple layers of what could be considered death in Tevat. Believe me, it's really not that simple at all. For now, we've reached the end of this video. Thanks for sticking around until now, everyone. I hope you enjoyed my work. If you did, then I'd be grateful if you could leave behind a like and subscribe to this channel for more Genshin lore related content in the future. My scripts for future videos are already piling up and I'll get to them, eventually. Well, hopefully soon. I had originally planned to release a short theory series called Genshin Lore Misconceptions before getting started on this deep dive, but I somehow ended up here in the end. In the future, you can expect 1 or maybe 2 videos every month on average. Not all of them will be as long and extensive as this one though. If you'd like to support me monetarily because you either appreciate my work or want to help me do more of what I love, I'd be truly thankful to you if you could check out my Patreon. And if you can't do so, I'd be just as happy if you could recommend my videos to anyone who is also interested in Genshin Impact lore. I'll be the first to admit that I don't do any self-promotion at all, which doesn't help. With all of that said, let me bid you farewell once more. I still have to finish writing my books and studying more about Genshin lore after all. I'll try to be back sooner with my next video this time. In the meantime, if you haven't seen my last video, I'd recommend you to check it out. I'm quite proud of it. See you all next time.